Good morning, everyone. I'm Asha Nayaswami, and we're continuing with our sheltering in place fireside chats. Those words are becoming a little tiresome to me. Sheltering in place is sort of like just life at this point. Plus everything is beginning to shift. I'm not quite sure what the words are. Fireside chats still apply. It's impossible for you all to know, but just to my right, even though it's the altar of this living room that I'm in, it used to be a fireplace. But, the fireplace was less useful than just closing it off and making it into an altar. So every time I say that, I actually feel like I'm sitting next to this fire. But I suppose fireside chat has become a way of talking. That we're all just together, we're sitting, we're just homey, it's just friends, there's nothing formal. And so here we are, and we will continue to do this as long as it seems valuable, for all of us to keep gathering like this. It certainly is giving me a way to feel that I'm contributing something to a very chaotic time in human history, which is not over by any means. So, my friends, let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your presence, calming our hearts and minds, filling us with the light of understanding and of love. Help us to know that you are always with us, holding our hands, guiding our footsteps, and that everything that comes to us is a loving gift to help us in our journey to our eternal home with thee. Om Peace. Amen. There is a concept on the spiritual path that is part of Sanatan Dharma. Sanatan Dharma is uh, the underlying truths of self-realization, which have been the cultural and spiritual background of India for time beyond measure. The Indian culture in the world is the only continuous civilization on the planet. There are physical places still in existence that have had many different civilizations, but in all places of long habitation, the civilizations, the characteristics of those civilizations have varied widely from era to era. The land that I live on, which is the North American continent that is called the US, the part of the continent called the USA right now, was inhabited for who knows how long by what had come to be called the Native Americans, American Indians, the indigenous people, whatever words you want to use. By the time the European settlers, the settlers from Europe, arrived on this land, very interestingly, the tradition of the Native Americans at that point was that there had already been the golden era of the people, as they called themselves. They just called themselves the people. And there was a tradition of the greatness of the people that was more than what was in existence at the time that the settlers started coming from Europe onto this land. It's just an interesting fact that relates to other things that I'm going to say in just a moment. And they had had a very glorious civilization, very, very different than the civilization that the Europeans brought. And the clash between the two resulted in the annihilation of the Native Americans, which Master said is a piece of very bad karma for the country of America. Overall, Master said the karma of America is good. I've talked about this at length in another broadcast. Overall, the karma of America is very good, he said, but the way we treated the Native Americans created bad karma, group karma for the country, which he said is yet to be expiated. And the expiation of that is what may be starting now, he said, which will be serious economic difficulties and various kinds of expressions of violence, either through international war or civil unrest, in order to expiate that karma. And then once that karma is expiated, America has a glorious future and will emerge intact and triumphant, purified and stronger from this. But it isn't finished yet. So let me think where I was going with that. So those, I'm trying to put it together. Oh yes, Sanatana Dharma. So those native peoples, knowing that their own tradition was on the wane. Of course, not everything that's written about this is all agrees, but this is a thread that I feel is valid. You know, they knew their tradition was on the wane, and there was this terrible clash, and the American settlers, the new American settlers, were the instrument for the ending of that civilization, but they were the instrument of a karma that was already in place. And so you have here as an example, there was a complete break in what the civilization was. The people inhabited this land, lived on it in a completely different way. An entirely new civilization was created, which gradually became the United States of America. And now we hold this land with this civilization. But there are some similarities. Master said interestingly that the Native American people's attunement to nature is kind of inherent here. And it is one of the themes, especially as America reemerges after the purification, that will come forward again. That attunement is inherent to the inhabitants of this landmass. Not visible now, but it's rising again. But India, by contrast, on that landmass has always been the same culture, essentially the same culture, that the changes have been small, relatively speaking. They find, manuscripts or evidence, statues of people doing yoga postures, evidence of meditation, traditions. It's just always been the same. And the variations have never completely twisted it and restarted it. And the principles that have always governed it are Sanatana Dharma. And Sanatana Dharma is defined in different ways. Eternal religion is one of the ways it's described. My favorite, though, is that which is. Sanatana Dharma is simply a statement of the way we are made, where suffering comes from, how happiness can be achieved. And Sanatana Dharma is consistently expressed in every true spiritual tradition. Some spiritual traditions, one of the measurements of the truth of a spiritual tradition is how closely it matches the principles of Sanatana Dharma. Now, of course, that's not a universally accepted measurement, but it's the measurement that many of us have come to believe is the right one, which includes that Satchidananda is the underlying reality, eternal consciousness, eternal bliss is the underlying reality, that we are all expressions of this, that we inhabit many bodies over the course of reincarnation, that our journey is for self-realization, that there is a law of karma, that we cannot violate the way we are made, that even though throwing ourselves into indulgence in the physical world appears to be a pleasure-producing way of life, in the end, it does not fulfill us. These are the principles of Sanatana Dharma. And so the 8 manifestations of God are one of the inherent principles of Sanatana Dharma that are not a question of my religion or your religion. It's the way that the divine force manifests in this world. Now, on the path of Ananda, on the path of self-realization, as we talk about it, we're always talking about being channels of God, being attuned with God, being an instrument of God. We talk even about remembering God, expressing God. The problem, of course, as I've said many times before, is the word God is a very, very abstract word. We have a very hard time. We can think and we can draw meaning from it based on our theology, our ideas, or our experience, but it remains somewhat vague. And it gets even more vague when we think, how can I be a channel of God? How can I manifest God in my life? But I find that the 8 manifestations of God, which I'm introducing today, and then I'm going to do, guess what, for 8 days, I'll do one broadcast on each one of them. I have found to be one of the most useful and most practical ways of taking what is otherwise an abstraction and actually making it into, oh dear, what do I do right now? I'm standing in my kitchen. The refrigerator, the food that I thought was going to be in the refrigerator isn't there. I'm upset about this. How do I manifest God in this moment? Somebody, my child has just had a meltdown and is lying on the ground, pounding the floor and screaming. How do I manifest God right in this moment? These are the actual practical problems. I've just looked at my checkbook and realized that somebody has stolen my identity and my checkbook. My bank account has been drained. How do I manifest God in this moment? It's like, it's not an obvious answer. We can't just don a white robe. I've commented before, people have written, some of them very good, but fictional accounts of biblical times, and have written about the Essene community, which is, I believe, was the context in which into which Jesus was born and his whole life took place. I think the Essene community was quite likely us, because it has so many similarities to Ananda, and with the uh, connection between Jesus and our path. I mean, this is just me speculating. This is the gospel according to Asha. Although when I asked Swami about it, he was not disinclined to endorse it. I'll just give myself that much credit. But some of thinking of it as being like us, I think of it differently. So in some of these Essene novels, they're trying to make it seem spiritual. And so one of the ways they make it seem spiritual is that every time anything has to happen, everybody takes a ritual bath and changes into a white robe, and then goes in a ceremonial way into their, whatever their sacred space is, to talk about, I don't know, what we're going to do about planting the corn or whatever it might be. And I'm exaggerating slightly, but I know from living in community, one, you don't have enough time to be taking all those baths and changing into all those white robes. Otherwise, it's not the way human nature works. And I most cheekily say, who does all the laundry? If you're changing into all those white robes, somebody's got to wash them all the time. It was a hot climate and they lived out in a primitive place. It just doesn't make any sense. But see, thoughts like that get in our mind. I'm supposed to manifest God. And so all of a sudden we sort of try to think, well, like, what would that look like? We just have to put on some fancy robe, and we have to have a voice. We have to have a special voice because now I'm manifesting God. Master, there was a spiritual leader who was contemporary of Master, and he had a big following. And he was Father somebody or another, and he had a throne that he would sit on, and on the top of the throne it actually said God. And he would sit on the throne and he would say God. Master was not annoyed. He thought it was terribly amusing. It was just like, this is how people think. I mean, Master was walking around in a complete state of God realization. So he didn't have to sit on a throne that said God above him. In another context, I was extremely both shocked and a little dismayed when I was invited to be part of a retreat for a group of clergymen whose denomination I won't mention. I have mentioned it before, but I won't mention it this time. Traditional clergymen. I had 2 friends who were part of that group, and they wanted me to come in and teach meditation, which I did. And we had a very nice weekend together, or a few days. Weekends are when clergy people work. So the weekend is Monday and Tuesday for clergy. But in any case, all of us, it was the first, I was very young in what I was doing, new to what I was doing. It was the first time I had ever tried to take our teachings into such a different environment. In fact, after the weekend was over, my friend said, They felt like I was constantly speaking a second language, that everything that was said to me, it would first have to be translated in my mind. I'd have to translate their words into my language. I have to think of my answer, and then I would have to translate my words into their language. And that was exactly how I felt, even though we were all speaking, we were all English as a first language people, and that was what we were doing. But I felt like I was in a context that I didn't know. And I was just trying to, it was very beneficial. And I think it was helpful to the people. And I certainly learned a lot about breaking boundaries and being too narrow. But here's what happened. It was time to say grace over lunch, really, literally. And because everyone was a clergy person, there was a little bit of good-natured jockeying for position as to who would be the spokesperson. And there was just a lot of teasing going back and forth. And then suddenly someone said in a voice like this, "Beloved Jesus." And I thought we were still kidding because I'd never heard anyone at Ananda pray like that. The way we prayed was the way we are. I mean, if you're saying something that has deep meaning to you, you don't use the same voice you use when you're playing soccer and you're trying to urge someone to make a goal. That sounds different than when you're saying Divine Mother, Heavenly Father, but it's not beloved Jesus, which is like you would never talk to Jesus if he were actually in front of you. That isn't actually how you would address him. It would startle him if you spoke like that. But it wasn't a joke because they that's how they thought of it. When if I'm going to be religious, I have to be somebody that I'm not. And it's a very serious question. How to really start from what we actually are, which is very ego defined and quite limited, and it's our perceptions of things, and in that reality be an instrument of God. And it isn't easy. I mean, quite apart from discipline and all that, it isn't even easy to know what it is that we're supposed to be. So Sanatan Dharma, and this is where the definition of Sanatan Dharma as that which is becomes so, for me, becomes so practical, because we're not trying to go somewhere else to be spiritual. I was doing a satsang recently, and one of the questions was, let's see, how was it exactly phrased? Oh, the problem of worldly duties interfering with my spiritual life. What do I do when my worldly duties interfere with my spiritual life? I said, the problem is the question. What is a worldly duty? When are you not in the presence of God? What could possibly happen to you that would suddenly make you not a child of God, and your life, your whole life, as a gift from Him, and every circumstance in your life being exactly what God wants you to have in order to bring you closer to Him? Where is worldly? Worldly is in our minds, when we suddenly separate ourselves from the divine and think, now I'm not with God anymore. That's worldly, not having to make money, work in a bank, work in a computer, write code. I mean, write code. That's the phrase. Of course, I live in Silicon Valley. Probably all of you know it too, where people write code to make your computers do things, which is just a huge part of what life is about right now, which inherently you're just putting these things together, doing all this stuff. But are you separated from God? Is your ability to do that separate from God? Is the energy that flows through you, the life force, all of that? It's all just in our minds, but it gets very confused. So the 8 manifestations, these are understandable, accessible qualities that we ourselves understand, that this is how God comes into the world. Now I'm going to speak about each one of these in greater length, but I'll just sort of start to make the example clear. Let's think of the one that most people think of the most, love. And that's usually where when we're speaking of the 8 manifestations, we almost always start with love. There are, it is said in the Bible, God is love. And that's pretty straightforward. So if you're thinking about manifesting God, if you love, then that's a good beginning, isn't it? You just start right there. The problem is, a lot of times you don't feel like loving. It's just love isn't the first thing that comes to mind. Sometimes quite opposite things come to mind. Right now and sometimes then we because God is love, we misapply that particular attribute because we think God is love and we don't understand that God manifests in this world, in at least in this context, 8 different ways, of which love is only one of them. Now, bear in mind that they're all integrated with each other. It's not like here's love, here's joy, here's peace. Of course, they all flow differently. But the way I think about it is that if I think about these 8 manifestations and if I really understand what each one means, at different times, I am more in tune with one or another of them. And let's put love and energy next to each other. Energy is also sometimes defined as power, but when I think of it as energy, I think it's more accessible. Okay? So something could happen in which I just don't feel very loving. In fact, I could be quite angry at someone for something that they did that I just it's just not in that moment. I'm not able to manifest love. So what do? Do I just collapse and decide that I have to give up my ideals of being a channel for God? I think no. God also manifests as energy. So of course, love is a kind of energy, but love is not the form that my energy is going to take at this point. Um, I'll use a specific example. Let me use a different one. We were involved. Ananda was involved in a certain kind of litigation for a long time, and at a certain point, a group of us had to travel to Los Angeles, and we took some depositions, which is where the two sides find out what's going on by under oath. We ask questions, and then the answers are given. And we spent a whole day in these depositions, and they were just crazy making, is the only thing I can say, because it was such a crazy situation. And what was being said to us was so disconcerting. Our peace or calmness was absolutely out of the question. Wisdom was not very accessible either, because there was no way. There was no way I could find it. Love wasn't even something to think about like that. But there was always energy. So I went to the gym to get on the treadmill, but I didn't have the right shoes, so they wouldn't let me into the gym. We were in a hotel. And fortunately, I guess I knew that there was a swimming pool, so I had brought a bathing suit with me. And the phrase I use is, I threw myself into the swimming pool because the only access I had to any of the manifestations of God was energy. And boy, did I have energy, but none of it was going anywhere I wanted it to go, but I had it. So I threw myself in the swimming pool and I swam up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down. And I put out energy. And I put out energy actually in quite a positive way, because for me, I rediscovered, this was like more than 20 years ago, and I rediscovered that putting out energy to swim is a really, really good thing for me to do. And it also becomes God reminding, because you breathe hard and you actually start breathing in this steady rhythm. And you're putting out energy. I was putting out physical energy, breathing in a steady rhythm. And my mind began to calm down. I began to feel a lot more peaceful. I remembered that even though I was upset with these people, they were also children of God. And a certain amount of wisdom began to come back in. I could never have accessed any of that directly. But of the 8 manifestations, there was one that worked. And so and it's there, throwing myself in the swimming pool is not quite the same as sitting down doing 108 kriyas, but it wasn't that different either, because I was doing it in order to bring my consciousness up. I knew my consciousness was in trouble and that I was not manifesting any expression of God. I wasn't loving, joyful, wise, peaceful, calm, or anything, but I could put out energy. And then I got in tune with one aspect of God, and then I kept going after that. So ever since then, just speaking personally, swimming for me, and because I live in an urban area where I can belong to a YMCA that has a indoor heated pool, so even in the winter, I can still do it. It's like many times since then, if I reach a certain wall, emotionally, psychologically, even spiritually, I throw myself in the swimming pool. Now I even use a snorkel. I'm being very exact because I'm wanting you to understand how the practical details matter. I use a snorkel. So immediately I'm in this deep, even breathing like this. And so I get back to God by swimming laps in a pool with the snorkel because energy is a manifestation of God. And then, of course, it elevates like that. It takes all the abstraction out of it. And sometimes, it's just cleaning the house. I'm not able to, well, not able to be calm or peaceful or to be wise because I can have all the philosophy in the world. I remember, well, we used to have this expression at Ananda Village because we were all such neophytes and not everything we did to try to help each other was the brightest thing to have done. I remember someone, I was involved in some situation and I was upset about what someone had done. And someone said to me, "Now don't be attached." I just thought, oh, really? Like, you think I couldn't have said that to myself? Like, what use is that to me? What I would call true but irrelevant. I have lots of wisdom. I mean, this is the backside of all the talking that I do. You know, if I can always give a philosophical explanation, and I can almost always explain the attitude that I should have, but that doesn't mean I can have it. So sometimes wisdom doesn't work. I find wisdom exceedingly helpful, and of the 8 manifestations of God, wisdom is one of my best friends because I can often change my consciousness by remembering a principle, but not always. Not always. Something else is required. Let me sort of just think, even just calming down. That's where the swimming is putting out energy, but what's restoring the calmness is the rhythmical breathing. And so one can go directly to the rhythmical breathing and just, create a state of physiological calmness, which all of a sudden allows wisdom to penetrate. And of course, sound is music. When I was having a, a kerfuffle of karma in the last couple of years, and I had a habit of having conversations with people who weren't in the room, in fact, who were hundreds of miles away, just, telling them what for, which is what we all do. We say what we wanted to say or would have said or wished we'd said, or just the mind starts running away with us. My friend told me to sing, not just generally to sing, but to sing Little Kathy. Little Kathy went dancing, went dancing, went dancing. A very silly song in a certain way, especially compared to the depth of the karmic kerfuffle I was involved in. But riding my bicycle on the way to the swimming pool, and since I have an electric bike, it didn't make me breathe hard enough, I would sing Little Kathy. And I found it impossible to simultaneously have wrong attitudes and be emotionally upset and sing Little Kathy. The sound of Little Kathy created a vibration in my consciousness that was absolutely incompatible with karmic kerfuffle. And so that particular song, partly because it was so light-hearted, anything that had more depth, more gravitas to it would have slipped me into the karmic kerfuffle, which was just full of gravitas. But little Kathy I just couldn't do it. The little robin dancing around the garden, it just didn't have anything to do with life and death issues that I was dealing with. Sound, sound. Little Kathy sung out loud going down, a street in Palo Alto on my bicycle was a manifestation of God. because it brought me closer and it changed my consciousness. So isn't this fun? It's just totally fun. I don't think I could have survived for many of these years if I hadn't had this in my toolbox. So, starting tomorrow, we'll just go one by one and talk about how we can use it, what it means, how they relate to each other. And I hope at the end of that, these principles of Sanatana Dharma will be as real and as useful to you as they have been to me. God bless you.